At the conclusion of Episode 3, Hermann Fegelein, following hysterics at his court-martial that had resulted in the proceedings being shut down, he had found himself handed over to SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, the dreaded head of the Gestapo, and taken to Müller's headquarters in the crypt of the Holy Trinity Church in central Berlin, not far from the Reich Chancellery. Müller had specifically been asked by Hitler to find who had been leaking information from Führer headquarters. And with Fegelein's apprehension and the discovery of his mistress's escape kit, it seemed clear that Fegelein's girlfriend was in fact an enemy agent, possibly British. Fegelein must have known this information, for when he was surprised at his girlfriend's Charlottenburg flat, he had been helping her to pack a case, and when that case's contents were examined at the Führerbunker by Martin Bormann, they contained not only mobile wealth in the form of jewellery, gold watches, cash, and precious stones, but also a collection of road maps of Berlin and its environs and 2 passports, both carrying the photograph of Fegelein's mistress, but each in different names, and 1 passport was British. If you think that someone like Fegelein consorting with an Allied spy is rather far-fetched, it wasn't in fact the first time that he had done so. Shortly after the German invasion of Poland in 1939, a friend of Fegelein's, a man named Albert Fassbender, the heir to a chocolate maker's fortune, had become romantically involved with a Polish woman called Jarosława Mirowska. Mirowska had previously been the mistress of a Jewish fur company owner in Warsaw called Apfelbaum. He had fled Warsaw ahead of the Germans, leaving his business in the hands of his non-Jewish mistress, Mirowska. It has emerged that Fegelein, at that time commanding the SS Cavalry Brigade, had worked in 1940 with Fassbender and Mirowska to bleed the company assets until virtually nothing was left, and then sold off the skeleton of the business, pocketing the proceeds. He had also developed a sexual relationship with Mirowska. Unfortunately for the conspirators, an SS judge charged with investigating corruption among SS officers in occupied Poland investigated their business dealings. However, Fegelein, who was close to Himmler, had previously introduced Mirowska to the Reichsführer SS, and he had personally intervened in the SS corruption investigation. Himmler had in fact arranged for Mirowska to be declared an ethnic German based on her looks, and when evidence emerged that Mirowska was also an agent for the Polish underground, Himmler actually intervened on her behalf and had her released from the Gestapo in 1941. Himmler consistently protected and promoted Fegelein, despite his questionable nature and doubtful company. Returning to Berlin in April 1945, further evidence of Fegelein's disloyalty was a suitcase recovered later by the Gestapo from Fegelein's Reich Chancellery room that contained sensitive documents belonging to both Fegelein and his boss Himmler, apparently describing overtures to the Western Allies. This case Fegelein had said he would hand over to Hitler's chief driver Erich Kempke at 10 p.m. on the 27th of April 1945 at the Führerbunker, asking him to hide it for him. However, Kempke never had a chance to meet Fegelein, for when he was on his way to the Führerbunker just before 10 p.m., Fegelein was being escorted back to the Führerbunker from his girlfriend's flat. There are various versions of what ultimately became of Fegelein. According to Hitler's adjutant, Major Otto Günscher, and Hitler's valet, SS Obersturmbannführer or Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Linger, based on their interrogations by the NKVD Soviet secret police, Hitler had initially demoted Fegelein from general to the rank of private in the SS, and ordered that he prove his loyalty by being transferred to a frontline combat unit in the city centre. Not unreasonably considering what Fegelein had been up to at the apartment, both Major Günscher and Martin Bormann told Hitler that such a move would only result in Fegelein absconding again. If you remember, Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the inner-city defense sector, had been very unhappy that Hitler had demoted Fegelein, believing that it was against the rules, and asked that Fegelein be placed before a court-martial of his peers, which Hitler had reluctantly agreed to. The court-martial had, as we saw in a previous episode, become a farce, and by the 28th of April, Fegelein was in Gestapo custody. Hitler appears to have vacillated concerning Fegelein's fate, which was understandable due to Fegelein being Eva Braun's brother-in-law. The event, most historians agree, sealed Fegelein's fate was the news of Himmler's secret negotiations with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back, which was revealed on purpose by the British, who leaked the information via the news agency Reuters and then repeated it on BBC Radio on the afternoon of the 28th of April 1945, undoubtedly hoping to sow further dissension in the highest-ranking circle that surrounded Hitler. When Hitler was informed of Himmler's treachery, initially he did nothing. However, he was worked on by Martin Bormann and the propaganda minister Dr. Goebbels, and eventually, after some hours, he was worked up into a rage, denouncing the Reichsführer SS and ordering his arrest, orders which Bormann gleefully attempted to carry out by radio to Grand Admiral Dönitz's headquarters in northern Germany, where Himmler had established a final headquarters close by. Though Dönitz chose not to follow such orders, fearful of a reaction by Himmler and his large bodyguard unit, a vengeful Hitler was able to strike at Himmler's SS liaison man at Führer headquarters, the disgraced coward Fegelein. According to one of Hitler's secretaries, Traudl Junge, Hitler calmed down after a while and gave the order that Fegelein be shot. Junge reported that Eva Braun's eyes were red from weeping, as she had pleaded with Hitler to spare her brother-in-law, if only for the sake of her sister Gretel, who had just given birth to Fegelein's daughter in Bavaria. Braun allegedly tried to excuse Fegelein's behavior as a perfectly natural impulse of a man wishing to be reunited with his beloved wife and child. Such a touching scene would have been somewhat more believable had Fegelein not been discovered attempting to flee Berlin in the company of his mistress. Many, including myself, believe that Fegelein's relationship with Gretel was not a genuine love match. Rather, it was a way for the career-minded Fegelein to increase his prestige at Führer headquarters and place himself closer to Hitler. And Fegelein's movements and activities since returning to Berlin on the 25th of April seem to have had little or no connection to his wife and child in southern Germany. So Hitler retired to his rooms in the bunker for a lengthy discussion with Dr. Goebbels and Bormann on the subject of Fegelein. According to some witnesses, on emerging from the meeting, he ordered Fegelein to be brought before him, and according to historian Sir Ian Kershaw, quote, subjected him to a fearsome verbal assault, end quote. Another version has it that Fegelein, who was by now sober, demanded an audience with Hitler, which was granted. In an attempt to defend himself, he believed actually he was being framed. However, Hitler would hear nothing of it. In fact, Hitler, it seems, had begun to believe that Reichsführer SS Himmler was plotting to have him assassinated. This was not a groundless fear, as I've shown in previous videos about Himmler's secret negotiations with the Western Allies stretching all the way back to 1943. The British negotiators consistently demanded that Himmler must move against Hitler before Churchill would discuss ending the war, interpreted by most historians as the British deliberately trying to encourage Himmler to mount a coup d'etat against the Führer, kill him and take power for himself. Hitler now ordered Fegelein to be summarily dealt with, though most historians agree that Hitler ordered Fegelein's execution on the afternoon of the 28th of April 1945, just 2 days before his own death. The actual circumstances of Fegelein's execution are very murky, and the disposal of his body almost completely unknown. According to Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, Fegelein was marched into the gardens above the bunker, escorted by an RSD officer that I believe was Lieutenant Colonel Peter Högel, the second-in-command of Hitler's bodyguard, and also an NCO the rank of Scharführer or sergeant from the RSD. According to several witnesses, Fegelein was shot in the neck by the SS sergeant on the orders of Högel, and according to Hitler's secretary Junge, the execution took place close to the statue of a little girl under some blossoming trees in the garden of the Foreign Ministry, which is adjacent to the Reichschancellery garden. Obviously, Junge did not witness the scene herself, but she heard about it soon afterwards on the bunker grapevine. Another version of Fegelein's execution has him shot in one of the basements of the Reichschancellery, and a third that he was shot in the crypt of Holy Trinity Church, where the Gestapo were interrogating him throughout the 28th of April. I think that these latter two ideas can be discounted because execution indoors was inadvisable. Shooting someone to death in an enclosed subterranean room would have deafened the gunman, made a tremendous amount of mess all over the floor and walls, and been dangerous to the gunman from potential bullet ricochet. The killers would then have to have laboriously hauled a bleeding corpse out of the cellar, up a flight of steps, and taken it outside to dump it. It would have been far more economical to simply march Fegelein out into a garden space, and as I mentioned, the garden of the Foreign Ministry was immediately adjacent to the Führerbunker area and could be accessed by another bunker exit at the rear of the Foreign Ministry building. Regardless of where exactly Fegelein was killed or the precise manner of his death, he was dead by around 11 p.m. on the 28th of April 1945, about 1 hour before Hitler married Eva Braun in the bunker. The identification of Obersturmbannführer Peter Högel, second in command of the RSD, as the man who shot Fegelein is interesting. Högel himself did not survive the end of the war. The identity of the sergeant who was with him, we don't know. But it's interesting because Högel was one of those officers sent to collect Fegelein from the apartment in Charlottenburg, and was of course deeply suspicious of his motives and behavior. However, SS Sergeant Rokus Misch, the bunker switchboard operator, told historians that he knew who exactly shot Fegelein, but refused to divulge his name. This suggests that whomever did it lived beyond the end of World War II and was probably alive around the time Rokus Misch was making these allegations. If it was Högel who was killed in May 1945, why would Misch try to cover this fact up? Also, it would suggest that if 2 or 3 men took him out there, the senior man, the officer, would have ordered the execution, and an SS NCO would have actually carried out the dirty work. As to what happened to Fegelein's body, there are various unsubstantiated claims about that. One has his body falling into or being pushed into a shell crater in the garden and quickly covered with earth. I find this highly unbelievable. The RSD who just killed Fegelein despised him for his cowardice and betrayal of Hitler. You think that such men were in any kind of mood to bother burying a man like Fegelein, particularly as the gardens of the Foreign Ministry and the Reich Chancellery were under sporadic Soviet shell fire. No one was going to risk their neck for that. Most likely, Fegelein's body, if he was shot in any of these gardens, was left where it fell, and later found and interred by German cleanup crews working under the supervision of the Red Army, interring rotting corpses from the Reich Chancellery area in mass graves nearby. Fegelein apparently went to his death wearing a uniform stripped of insignia and decorations, and undoubtedly his identity papers and dog tags were taken from him as well. His body was probably damaged later by artillery fire, as it would have laid outside for several days following the shooting. This is my supposition, not backed by any evidence other than the reported condition of other corpses found in the Reich Chancellery gardens after the battle. So, to conclude this story, did Fegelein have an escape plan, and what was it? Well, I believe he did, but of course it's very difficult to say with any certainty. He returned to Berlin from his final meeting with Himmler on the 25th of April 1945, flown back into the now encircled Berlin in a plane ordered for his use by the Reichsführer himself. He went to his girlfriend's secret apartment, and the two of them busied themselves over the next day and a half with gathering materials needed for their joint escape. These preparations also included Fegelein testing the route for a small convoy of soft-skin vehicles between the Reich Chancellery garage and close to the secret apartment. We know Fegelein called Eva Braun at least twice during this period, begging her to leave the city with him. Was this the purpose of the vehicle test? To have convinced Braun to leave Hitler and the bunker and go with Fegelein and his mistress to safety, presumably to Himmler's headquarters? Perhaps, but it may also have had something to do with the documents and the gold bars and other materials the Gestapo later found in Fegelein's Reich Chancellery quarters. If you recall, Fegelein specifically asked for 2 cars from the Reich Chancellery garage instead of 1 or 3. Was car number 1 for himself and a driver and perhaps his less than convinced aide-de-camp, and the second vehicle, with driver, for some baggage and a trunk from his quarters, containing mobile wealth and some very sensitive documents that neither he nor Himmler wanted anyone to see. The small convoy would drive from the Reich Chancery garage to the apartment, a distance of about 4 miles, collect Fegelein's mistress and her baggage, and then drive to the emergency airstrip on the east-west axis in the Tiergarten, where Fegelein, his mistress, and his aide and the baggage would board the Junkers 52 we know was waiting there for some purpose, to fly perhaps northwest to safety at Himmler's headquarters. The documents would then be safe, shielding Himmler from discovery, or at least he thought, while he was continuing to try and ingratiate himself with the Western Allies. Fegelein's mistress may be the key to this entire story. It seems that she was an enemy agent and that Fegelein was the person leaking information from Führer headquarters, wittingly or unwittingly. I think the woman was Fegelein's ticket to post-war freedom. I can't help thinking that she was linked in some way with Himmler's secret negotiations with the British. Perhaps she was Fegelein's handler, and in return for saving her from Berlin, some deal had been arranged for Fegelein by her masters. At this time, Himmler was being led up the garden path by British intelligence for its own nefarious reasons. He had had intermittent contact with the British since at least 1943, and we know, of course, that British intelligence had been urging him to stage a coup against Hitler. We could draw up scenarios to explain Fegelein's mysterious mistress in all this, but I firmly believe he returned to Berlin on Himmler's instructions for 2 reasons: to collect documents and mobile wealth from his Reich Chancery quarters and his mistress from her apartment. These plans came to naught because he drew too much attention to himself from Hitler and the ever-suspicious Martin Bormann at the bunker. I'm open to any suggestions from viewers. The woman and the documents feel like the key to this story. But of course, I can't prove my suppositions. It is based only on analysis of the available circumstantial evidence and a hunch on my part. I think this series has shown that the death of Hermann Fegelein was far more complex and interesting than it's often been portrayed in books and films. There is still a deep mystery surrounding it over 80 years after Fegelein was executed. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.